Lucy Hart had never planned to spend a summer in the mountains, but life has a way of placing you where you least expect it, and after the sudden passing of her uncle she found herself inheriting temporary stewardship of a weathered log cabin deep within a pine valley. The cabin was not hers outright. Her uncle's estate was still entangled in legal formalities, and for now she had been given the right to maintain it until matters were settled. But when she unlocked the door for the first time, stepping into the dim interior that smelled of cedar and ash, she felt an undeniable connection to the place, as though every uneven floorboard carried a story that was meant for her alone. Lucy was not the type of woman to seek out remote living. She worked as a seismologist, her life structured around data streams and research projects, usually tethered to laboratories or offices, yet a new assignment had placed her on remote work for several months, and the thought of combining field reports with solitude in a landscape so raw and unaltered seemed like a strange kind of gift. The silence of the forest was unlike anything she had known in the city. It pressed against her ears until even the beating of her own heart felt amplified. And when she woke her first morning to see mist curling between the trees, she realized she had underestimated how quickly a human being could grow attached to a place that demanded nothing and gave only stillness in return. For 3 days she lived without interruption, hauling water from the well, scrubbing dust from shelves, mending a broken shutter, and gradually adjusting to the peculiar rhythm of a house that creaked with every gust of wind. Then, on the evening of the 4th day, as the sun stretched low across the ridge and painted the valley in a dim, orange haze, she noticed a woman standing at the edge of her clearing, as still as one of the trees, dressed in a pale jacket with her hair pinned into an almost severe bun. Lucy approached with polite caution, brushing pine needles from her jeans, and the woman introduced herself as Karen Marsh, a neighbor from the nearest road settlement 2 miles away. Karen's smile was sharp, the kind that seemed practiced, and while her words were friendly, thanking Lucy for keeping the place alive, there was a hint of scrutiny in the way her eyes moved over the cabin, as though evaluating whether Lucy belonged here at all. She asked questions not in the tone of idle conversation, but with the clipped cadence of someone filing an invisible report. When had Lucy arrived? How long she intended to stay? What she planned to do with the cabin once legal issues were cleared. Lucy answered carefully, not wishing to be rude, and eventually Karen made a comment that at first sounded harmless, yet lodged itself uncomfortably in Lucy's mind. This was always a crossing point. People walked through here for decades. I hope you won't fence it off or make it difficult for locals to pass. Lucy was taken aback because the cabin sat in a clearing surrounded entirely by dense woodland with no visible path. She explained that she had seen no trail markings, no signage, nothing that suggested a recognized hiking route, but Karen only tilted her head with an expression of mild disapproval, replying, "Just because something doesn't appear on the new maps, doesn't mean it isn't real. Around here, we remember." With that, she left as quietly as she had arrived, disappearing into the trees without so much as a wave, and Lucy stood in the fading light with a strange feeling that the forest around her had shifted. That night, as she listened to the owls echoing across the valley, she thought again about Karen's words, and felt the first tremor of unease in what had until then seemed like a perfect retreat. The following week passed with a deceptive calmness, and Lucy began to believe that perhaps her neighbor's strange remark had been nothing more than a territorial quirk, an almost folkloric attachment to land that older residents in remote communities sometimes clung to, but her assumption was shattered one morning when she returned from a supply trip to the town at the bottom of the valley and found an official envelope tucked beneath the cabin's doorframe, the paper stiff and heavy, the typeface formal in a way that made her heart immediately sink. Inside was a letter from the Regional Forestry Administration, written in the language of bureaucracy that concealed accusation behind formality, informing her that a complaint had been lodged against her property, specifically alleging that the cabin obstructed access to a historic public hiking trail, and therefore the legality of the cabin's structure and her right of occupancy were under review pending presentation of documentation. Lucy read the letter twice before lowering herself into the old wooden chair by the window, the words pressing into her like cold fingers. Obstructing access, under review, pending documentation. Her first instinct was confusion because the cabin had stood for more than half a century without issue, its foundations sinking gently into soil that bore the weight of countless seasons, and she could not recall ever seeing a marked trail anywhere. Near it, only deer tracks and the faint grooves left by rainwater running downhill. Yet the letter implied something more concrete, something not merely claimed but written down with coordinates and references to traditional routes, which meant whoever had filed the complaint had done so with a degree of preparation. She immediately thought of Karen, whose odd comment now seemed less casual and more calculated, and as she held the envelope in her hand, she felt a deepening suspicion that the woman's presence in her clearing had been the opening move of something larger. Determined not to be intimidated, Lucy drove back into town the next day and sought out the Public Records Office, a low brick building with shelves lined by fading maps and dust-coated ledgers. The clerk on duty listened politely as Lucy explained her situation, and then directed her to a collection of topographical surveys stored in cylindrical cases. For hours she unrolled maps across the counter, tracing lines of contour, following faint dotted trails that curved across ridges and valleys. Finally, she found a map from the early 1990s that indeed showed a designated hiking trail running through the region. Yet when she followed the dotted line closely, her breath caught. It did not pass through her cabin's clearing at all, but rather veered south where the map placed a small marker for a trail junction, directly on what she recognized as the land now occupied by Karen Marsh's house. The realization struck her with such clarity that she momentarily wondered if Karen herself had ever looked at the documents she now used as ammunition, because on this official record, the obstruction was not Lucy's weathered cabin, but Karen's neatly painted suburban-style dwelling. Still, the existence of an old trail did not entirely resolve the issue, because Lucy knew that maps evolved, trails were rerouted, and without current confirmation she could not dismiss the possibility of further complications. She requested access to more recent surveys and found that in every subsequent edition the trail marker vanished entirely, replaced by new routes farther west, suggesting that the original path had been decommissioned or shifted decades earlier. Relief mingled with anger as she realized that the accusation lodged against her relied on outdated or deliberately misrepresented information. Yet she also understood the danger. In disputes of land and heritage, perception often outweighed fact, and once a complaint was registered, authorities could be pressured into lengthy investigations that drained time, money, and patience. When she returned to the cabin that evening, dusk pressing down on the valley, she found something that unsettled her even more than the letter, a freshly carved wooden sign planted at the edge of her clearing, its surface hastily sanded and painted, with the words "Historic Trail Access" and an arrow pointing directly toward her cabin. The wood was still raw, the nails recently driven, and Lucy felt a chill as she realized that someone had entered her property in her absence to install this marker. It was not an idle threat, but a physical attempt to rewrite the landscape, to create the illusion of a public right-of-way where none existed. She removed the sign, leaned it against the wall inside, and sat in the half-light with a pounding heart, aware that this was no misunderstanding but a deliberate effort to corner her into defense. The following day she received another document, this time from the Homeowners Association representing the scattered community along the road below. Though her cabin was technically outside their formal jurisdiction, the letter insisted that community concerns compelled them to review her occupancy and requested immediate attendance at a meeting to discuss neighbor relations and access. It writes, "The intrusion of yet another body into the dispute made Lucy's frustration boil. Her cabin was not part of their association, yet Karen seemed to be extending her influence through any channel she could, weaving a network of pressure to isolate Lucy. As she prepared her notes and gathered the few papers she had, copies of maps, the deed transferring temporary stewardship to her name, her uncle's old property tax receipts, Lucy realized that what unnerved her most was not the bureaucracy itself, but the sense of being trapped in a narrative that someone else was writing. Karen had appeared friendly at first, then planted the seed of the trail story, then set official wheels in motion, and now physical signs were sprouting on her land like invasive weeds. Each step seemed orchestrated to escalate the conflict, to paint Lucy as the outsider intruding upon communal memory. And though Lucy was a scientist trained to analyze faults and tremors, she found herself struggling to calculate the shifting ground beneath her own feet. The forest that had seemed so calm now felt crowded with unseen eyes, and she lay awake at night listening not to the owls but to the imagined footsteps of someone retracing an invented trail past her window. Lucy had hoped that the meeting organized by the Homeowners Association might provide clarity, or at least give her an opportunity to present the documents she had found. But what she walked into instead felt less like a discussion and more like a tribunal staged in a borrowed community hall, a long table at the front where 3 members sat with folded hands and faintly disapproving expressions, a cluster of folding chairs filled with neighbors she barely recognized, and Karen herself, positioned near the center like a conductor waiting to raise her baton. The air smelled of coffee gone cold in its urn and paper that had been photocopied one too many times, and Lucy, clutching her folder of maps and receipts, felt for the first time that she was not simply defending her uncle's cabin, but standing trial for her very right to exist in the valley. The chairman began with a tone of weary neutrality, stating that concerns had been raised regarding historic trail access and the placement of structures in areas potentially designated as traditional crossings, and that the association wished to hear all perspectives before considering a recommendation to county authorities. Immediately, Karen spoke up, her voice crisp, describing how generations of residents had used the Valley Pass as a walking route, how the cabin had gradually encroached, and how Lucy's recent arrival coincided with what she described as a hostile refusal to acknowledge community heritage. Lucy rose to respond, laying the 1990s map on the table and explaining that the dotted line ran through the land now occupied by Karen's own house. But before she could elaborate, murmurs spread among the seated neighbors, some nodding, others frowning, the weight of collective memory rising against the sharp lines of her printed evidence. One older man, his voice rough with age, muttered that he remembered walking up near the Hart place as a boy, though when pressed for details his description veered south toward Karen's property, but the nuance seemed to evaporate in the collective atmosphere, replaced by the more powerful suggestion that Lucy, the outsider, was attempting to dismantle what locals held sacred. When she pointed out that newer maps excluded the trail entirely, Karen countered with a stack of black-and-white photographs showing children posing with backpacks and walking sticks, though the backgrounds were vague, indistinct ridges and trees that could have been taken anywhere in the region. Still, the effect was persuasive, a flood of nostalgia that washed over the room, and Lucy, standing alone with her rational explanations, realized she was being outmaneuvered not with facts but with sentiment. The meeting ended without a decision, but the chairman concluded by saying the association would forward its concerns to the county, advising Lucy to cooperate to avoid escalation. When she left the hall, Karen caught her eye with a look of thin triumph, a silent declaration that the game had only just begun. That night, Lucy returned to the cabin exhausted, yet unable to sleep, staring at the folder of maps that suddenly felt fragile, paper shields against a tide of communal pressure. In the days that followed, the tension deepened. Lucy discovered 2 more signs planted along the forest edge, one reading, "Trail, please respect access," another nailed crudely to a tree declaring, "Historic path, do not obstruct." The handwriting was uneven, the boards rough, but their placement was strategic, just visible to hikers who occasionally wandered from the main road, suggesting to passers-by that her cabin was blocking something communal. Strangers began to appear more frequently near her clearing, some pausing to peer through the trees, others moving with the practiced ease of those following directions. Once she confronted a pair of walkers, asking what brought them there, and they replied casually that they had read online about a lost trail reopening in the valley, though when pressed they could not say where they had found the information. Someone was spreading the story deliberately, shaping public perception so that Lucy's cabin became an obstacle in a narrative that was rapidly gaining traction. The pressure was not confined to whispers and signs. One afternoon, she returned from town to find her porch scattered with damp flyers, their ink smudged by rain, proclaiming, "Restore our trail," and bearing a blurred photograph of a path vanishing into trees. She burned them in the old stone fire pit, watching the smoke curl upward, but the sense of violation lingered, the knowledge that someone had trespassed and littered her sanctuary with propaganda. On another night, she awoke to faint lights moving among the trees, not the steady glow of lanterns, but flickering beams of flashlights sweeping the undergrowth. She stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass, and listened to muffled voices debating directions, until eventually the lights receded, leaving behind only the steady hum of crickets. Lucy reached out again to the Forestry Administration, providing her maps and copies of more recent surveys, and the official she spoke with admitted quietly that the complaint dossier had indeed been filed with unusually detailed geographic data, including GPS coordinates and descriptions that mirrored language Karen herself had used during the meeting. The official, though sympathetic, warned Lucy that until the matter was formally reviewed, she should avoid altering anything on the land that could be construed as interfering with potential heritage access, advice that struck Lucy as absurd, yet revealed the power of paperwork once it was placed in circulation. She realized that she was now effectively under observation. Her actions weighed against accusations that had no basis yet carried the momentum of formality. The breaking point came one evening when she returned to find her cabin door ajar, the lock unbroken but the wood scraped as though forced with a blunt tool. Inside, nothing was stolen, but objects had been moved. Her maps shifted from the desk, her uncle's compass lying open on the floor, a chair slightly turned as though someone had sat briefly before leaving. The intrusion felt less like burglary and more like a message, a demonstration that her boundaries could be crossed at will. Lucy stood in the center of the room, the silence of the forest pressing against the windows, and understood that the escalation was no longer symbolic. The campaign was becoming physical, invasive, designed to break her resolve piece by piece until she either surrendered the cabin or fled the valley entirely. And as she closed the door and set a chair beneath the handle for the night, she wondered whether she had underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go in order to rewrite the land's story in her own favor. By the time August settled into the valley, Lucy felt as though the cabin's wooden walls had grown thinner, not from age but from the relentless pressure of eyes and voices that seemed to press against them day after day. For while she still woke, each morning to the cool hush of mist rising between the pines, there was no longer peace in that silence, only the anticipation of interruption. She had taken to locking every window at night, storing her documents in a fireproof box she dragged from town, and walking the perimeter of the clearing with a flashlight each evening, though she knew these small measures were less defense than ritual, a way to remind herself that she had not surrendered. Yet her determination wavered when she discovered that the county had formally acknowledged the association's concerns and scheduled a preliminary hearing, an administrative step rather than a full court session, but one that carried the weight of legitimacy, and she realized with sick clarity that the complaint had matured from rumor into official procedure. Preparing for the hearing, she returned to the archives in town, driven not by curiosity but desperation, and after long hours among dust-coated drawers and maps folded into brittle squares, she stumbled upon a leather-bound ledger kept by the Forestry Service during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a register of trail adjustments, closures, and reroutes. Flipping through with careful fingers, she found an entry that made her throat tighten. South Ridge Trail. Closure approved, rerouted west due to slope instability, effective July 1992. The description matched precisely the area near her cabin, noting erosion concerns and the decommissioning of the original route. More importantly, the ledger contained a sketch map showing the original dotted line running directly through what was now Karen Marsh's backyard, with a notation that the closure had been publicized and replacement signage installed at the time. Lucy photocopied the page, her pulse quickening, and carried it back to the cabin as though it were a shield forged from iron. For here at last was not just a map, but a formal record of administrative action. Proof that the so-called trail had been legally erased decades ago. Yet evidence alone did not soothe her unease, because when she arrived home she found a new intrusion waiting. On the porch lay a small stack of photographs in a plastic sleeve, clearly printed from an old film roll, depicting the cabin itself at various angles, though the images were blurred and discolored. On the back of one photo someone had scrawled, "Never belonged here." The delivery was silent, no note of explanation, but its meaning was plain. Someone wanted her to know that she was being watched, not only now but in some imagined continuity of time that cast her as the intruder. She destroyed the photographs in the fire pit, yet their ghost lingered in her mind, joining the heavy knot of dread that no document could entirely untangle. The hearing took place in a bland county office, a room with beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights, where Lucy sat opposite Karen and her attorney, a polished man with a briefcase that gleamed as if oiled. Lucy presented her maps, the ledger photocopy, and the property deed. She spoke clearly, her voice steadier than she felt, describing how the trail had been legally closed and rerouted long before she assumed stewardship of the cabin. Karen countered not with evidence, but with conviction, telling the officials that maps were only paper, but memories lived in bodies, that the people of the valley had walked the path for generations, and that Lucy's refusal to honor tradition was a form of cultural vandalism. At one point, she produced a faded cloth banner embroidered with the words, "Trail Day 1978, holding it aloft like a relic, and Lucy watched the officials shift uneasily, caught between law and sentiment. In the end, the panel acknowledged Lucy's documentation, but declined to dismiss the complaint outright, citing the need for further review and site inspection. The words felt like defeat, even though logic was on her side, for what mattered was that the machinery of bureaucracy continued to grind forward, keeping her tethered to a process designed to exhaust. As they left the building, Karen paused beside her, leaning close enough that Lucy could feel the brush of her breath, and whispered, "Paper fades. People remember. You won't outlast me." Then she walked away without waiting for a response, her lawyer trailing like a shadow. The following days brought a deeper escalation. Strangers continued to appear in the woods, though now they carried cameras, snapping photographs of the cabin as if collecting evidence. Lucy attempted to confront one man, demanding to know who had sent him, but he merely smiled and said, "Public right-of-way," before vanishing into the trees. More signs appeared, more flyers circulated, and the atmosphere shifted from rumor to campaign, as if someone were orchestrating a movement with Lucy as its chosen villain. One morning she awoke to find spray-painted words on the side of her woodshed. "Trail taken back." The letters dripped with fresh paint, crude and uneven, but their message was loud, and Lucy realized that Karen was no longer relying solely on officials. She was rallying others, turning the valley itself against the woman in the cabin. It was during this period of siege that Lucy made her most critical discovery. She returned once more to the public archive, driven by a gnawing suspicion that the ledger and maps were only fragments of a larger story, and there, tucked among microfilmed council minutes, she uncovered a record of a land dispute from 1993. in, which Karen Marsh's then-husband had petitioned to expand their property boundaries to encompass the decommissioned trail corridor. The petition had been denied, citing the closure of the trail and the corridor's retention under state management. Yet the file contained correspondence suggesting that Karen had continued using the land informally, planting shrubs and extending fences into the corridor without approval. Reading the yellowed pages, Lucy felt the sudden clarity of a puzzle snapping into place. Karen was not defending heritage but erasing history, reshaping memory to conceal her own encroachment. If the trail were reimagined as still existing, then her house would no longer be guilty of occupying its path. Instead, the guilt would shift to Lucy's cabin, an inversion of truth that allowed Karen to preserve her own claim. The weight of this revelation both strengthened and terrified Lucy. She now possessed a motive that explained Karen's crusade, but exposing it meant escalating the conflict beyond neighborly quarrel into direct accusation, and she understood instinctively that Karen would not retreat quietly. As she walked back to the cabin that evening, documents clutched like contraband, she glanced at the forest around her and felt the uncanny sensation that the trees themselves leaned closer, listening, as though the valley had become a stage upon which two women struggled not merely over property but over the power to define reality itself. That night, as wind shook the cabin's shutters and shadows shifted across the ceiling, Lucy lay awake realizing she had crossed an invisible threshold. The dispute was no longer about legality alone, but about survival of will, and in this contest, facts could be twisted, memories recruited, neighbors swayed until truth itself buckled beneath the weight of repetition. Yet, despite the fear, a spark of defiance kindled within her, for she knew now that Karen's story was not immutable. Somewhere in the archives, in the soil, in the memories of those who had lived through the valley's past, lay the fragments of a counter-narrative, one strong enough to dismantle the illusion. And Lucy, though unprepared for battle, resolved that she would gather those fragments, piece them together, and fight, not only for the cabin but for her right to stand unbowed in the place that circumstance had chosen for her. Lucy had expected the aftermath of the county hearing to bring a pause, a lull in which the officials digested documents and memories before issuing their next statement. But instead, the weeks that followed became a torrent of pressure, unlike anything she had endured before, as though Karen, sensing that the ground beneath her argument was beginning to crumble, had decided that subtle manipulations and nostalgic appeals were no longer sufficient, that only escalation on every front could secure her story. It began with letters, formal complaints arriving not just from the Homeowners Association, but from newly invented committees whose names seemed pulled from thin air: the Valley Heritage Trust, the Friends of the South Ridge Path, the Committee for Public Access Rights, each demanding Lucy's cooperation and threatening to petition higher authorities if she did not comply. She suspected most of these groups existed only on paper, perhaps with a post office box registered under different names but guided by the same hand. Yet the effect was overwhelming. Her mailbox stuffed with demands, her email flooded with messages, warning of further consequences, her days consumed by the task of responding, copying, and filing, until her research work languished and her life revolved entirely around defending her right to inhabit the cabin. The campaign did not remain confined to paper. Strangers continued to appear near her clearing, but now they carried not only cameras but tools, measuring tapes stretched across tree lines, GPS devices clicking as they marked coordinates, tripods planted in the soil as if conducting surveys. Lucy confronted one group, demanding to know their authority, but they laughed and claimed to be volunteers assisting the community. When she threatened to call the sheriff, they retreated, leaving behind bright orange ribbons tied around tree trunks, a mocking echo of official survey markers that suggested her cabin stood in the path of something imminent. Removing the ribbons brought no relief, for each morning new ones appeared, their fluorescent colors winking between the pines like signals. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Lucy discovered that the door to her woodshed had been forced open. Inside, tools were scattered, and on the wall someone had scrawled in charcoal, "Move before the trail moves you." The threat was crude, yet its impact was devastating, because it marked a transition from symbolic gestures to explicit intimidation. She reported the vandalism to the sheriff's office, but the deputy who arrived seemed reluctant, noting that without witnesses or clear suspects there was little they could do. Lucy mentioned Karen's name, but the deputy only sighed and said that neighbor disputes often became messy, advising her to install better locks and keep her head down until matters cooled. Lucy recognized the futility of expecting intervention. The law moved slowly, while Karen's campaign moved with relentless speed. The pressure seeped into her daily rhythms, eroding her sense of sanctuary. She began to notice her groceries tampered with, cartons of eggs cracked inside the box, bread packages slit open, vegetables bruised as if deliberately mishandled. At first, she dismissed these as accidents of transport, but when it happened repeatedly, she understood the message. You are not safe anywhere, not even in town. On another occasion, she returned from the market to find tire tracks across her clearing, deep ruts pressed into the soil leading dangerously close to the cabin's porch, though no vehicle remained. The intrusion felt deliberate, a demonstration of access, proof that her boundaries could be crossed without consequence. Meanwhile, Karen intensified her public offensive. At a second association meeting, Lucy heard her neighbor stand and declare that Lucy was endangering hikers by refusing to acknowledge the trail, claiming that recent near accidents had occurred when visitors attempted to navigate around the cabin. No evidence was provided, yet whispers spread quickly, and Lucy found herself greeted with cold stares in the grocery store, conversations breaking off when she entered a cafe, neighbors who had once offered polite nods now crossing the street rather than meet her gaze. Isolation deepened around her, as though Karen's narrative had become a truth absorbed by repetition, turning the valley into a community of silent accusers. It was in this atmosphere of siege that Lucy unearthed her most damning piece of evidence. Digging deeper into the archives, she discovered correspondence from the early 90s between Karen's late husband and county officials, in which he attempted to argue that the decommissioned trail still existed in common use. The officials had rejected the claim, attaching photographs showing newly installed signs directing hikers to the rerouted path far to the west. One letter even mentioned a warning issued to the Marsh family for extending their garden fence into the abandoned corridor. Reading these documents, Lucy felt a surge of vindication, for here was proof not only that the trail had been legally closed, but that Karen had been on notice for decades, fully aware that her property sat on what once had been the route. Yet she also knew that presenting this evidence would provoke a reaction, for it exposed not merely a false claim but a deliberate manipulation stretching back years, a rewriting of history to cover encroachment. Her fear proved justified when, within days of retrieving the letters, she returned to the cabin to find a dead fox placed on her porch, its body stiff, its fur mottled with flies. The gruesome offering was unmistakable in its intent, and Lucy, choking on the stench, dragged it away with trembling hands before burying it beneath the trees. She reported the incident, but once again the deputy only shook his head, noting that wild animals often died near homes, though he avoided her eyes as he spoke, as if aware that his dismissal rang hollow. That night, Lucy sat by the fire with the letters spread before her, the glow of the flames trembling across the pages, and realized that she stood at the edge of something darker than she had anticipated. This was no longer about maps or trails, not even about property lines. It was about control, about one woman's willingness to marshal every tactic of fear and pressure to bend reality until it aligned with her story. Yet, amid the dread, Lucy felt a hardening resolve. She understood now that retreat would mean more than surrendering the cabin. It would mean confirming Karen's narrative, allowing falsehood to triumph over truth. The documents she held were more than defense. They were weapons, fragments of a history Karen had tried to bury, and Lucy knew she had to bring them into the light, no matter the cost. She began drafting a formal petition to the county, attaching copies of the letters, the ledger, and the maps, assembling a timeline that revealed Karen's decades-long campaign of distortion. Each page she typed felt like striking a blow against the encroaching darkness, though she also sensed the inevitable retaliation it would provoke. As she sealed the envelope, preparing to send it the next morning, she whispered aloud to the empty cabin, "It ends here." But even as she spoke the words, a faint sound outside made her freeze. The crunch of footsteps across gravel, slow, deliberate. Circling the clearing, she extinguished the lamp standing in darkness, heart hammering, listening to the silence swallow the sound, until only the whisper of wind remained. Whoever had come did not knock, did not speak, but their presence lingered like a shadow against the walls. Lucy understood then that the second escalation was not only bureaucratic and social, but physical, an invisible siege pressing closer with each passing night. And though fear twisted her stomach, she clenched her fists and vowed she would not abandon the cabin, for the fight had crossed a threshold, and only by enduring could she hope to expose the truth Karen had labored so long to erase. The courtroom was smaller than Lucy had imagined. A narrow chamber with faded carpet and high windows that admitted bars of pale daylight. Yet the air inside carried the weight of finality, as though the walls themselves had absorbed decades of disputes, decisions, and grudges sealed into record. She sat at the table with her attorney, a quiet man recommended by a sympathetic clerk who had noticed her exhaustion at the records office, and in front of them lay the carefully organized binder that had consumed her nights, copies of the forestry ledger, the trail closure notice, the rejected petition from Karen's late husband, photographs of the rerouted signs, and the letters warning the Marsh family against encroachment. Across the aisle, Karen appeared immaculate, dressed in a tailored suit of pale gray that seemed designed to project authority, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with the satisfaction of a woman certain she was about to witness an opponent's collapse. Her attorney shuffled through a stack of glossy exhibits, photographs of hikers, community petitions signed with dozens of names, a handful of weathered artifacts like the embroidered banner and faded photographs that had so swayed the hearing panel. When the judge entered and proceedings began, Karen's attorney moved swiftly, presenting her as the guardian of heritage, a neighbor struggling to preserve communal memory against an outsider who refused cooperation. He invoked the language of tradition, community rights, and the moral weight of preserving what he called the valley's living trail. His voice carried the rhythm of practiced persuasion, and several in the gallery nodded in agreement, their expressions hardened by the conviction that Lucy was not merely defending property, but attacking history itself. Then it was Lucy's turn, and her attorney rose with measured calm, sliding the binder onto the lectern, opening first to the ledger entry that documented the closure of the Southridge Trail in 1992, pointing out the administrative stamp and the reference number that tied it to state action. He followed with the letters from the early 90s, reading aloud the warning issued to the Marsh family about unauthorized expansion into the abandoned corridor, emphasizing that Karen had long known the truth she now sought to erase. Finally, he presented the photocopied council minutes rejecting the Marsh petition, the denial marked by signatures of officials still traceable through the county archive. The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable, a current of unease running through the spectators as they realized the weight of paper could outweigh sentiment. Karen attempted to interrupt, rising with an outburst that the documents were fabricated, that Lucy had tampered with archives, but the judge silenced her sharply, demanding order. When her attorney attempted to argue that living memory should hold equal weight to written record, Lucy's attorney countered with quiet force, reminding the court that law could not be built on recollection alone, that boundaries of property and rights of access were defined by record, not nostalgia. He then produced the most devastating evidence, a sworn statement from a retired forestry officer whom Lucy had tracked down after weeks of inquiries, a man who had personally supervised the rerouting of the Southridge Trail, who affirmed in his affidavit that the original path had been closed for safety reasons and that the cabin had never obstructed public land. The judge leaned forward, studying the affidavit, then looked directly at Karen, his expression narrowing as though measuring the distance between her poise and her desperation. For the first time, Karen faltered, her composure cracking into frantic words, accusing Lucy of conspiracy, accusing officials of betrayal, her voice rising until it echoed harshly against the chamber walls. The judge struck his gavel, restoring silence, and announced that the evidence was conclusive. The trail had been formally decommissioned, the cabin stood within lawful boundaries, and the complaint filed by Karen Marsh was unfounded. Moreover, the court would be forwarding the matter of false filings and deliberate harassment for review by county prosecutors, a statement that dropped into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock across the gallery. Lucy sat motionless as the words sank in, the tension that had bound her chest for months loosening into something almost painful in its release. She glanced at Karen, who sat rigid, her face drained of triumph, her hands clutching the arms of her chair as though anchoring herself against collapse. The bailiff moved toward the tables, shuffling papers. The judge rose, and in that moment Lucy felt not victory in the ordinary sense, but survival, the knowledge that she had endured the full weight of Karen's campaign and had not broken. The law had spoken, and for once, the truth she carried on fragile sheets of paper had prevailed over the noise of manipulation. Outside the courthouse the air was cool, the sky streaked with clouds, and as Lucy stepped into the street, she felt the strangeness of freedom, the sudden absence of pressure that had defined her every waking moment. Yet even in relief there lingered unease, for Karen had not vanished, only been unmasked, and Lucy knew the valley would remember this day in more than one version. Still, she held the binder against her chest like armor, and for the first time since unlocking the cabin door she allowed herself to believe that the fight could end not in retreat, but in permanence, that the home she had come to defend was not merely shelter but testament, proof that some narratives once challenged could no longer be rewritten. The return to the cabin after the verdict felt unreal, as though Lucy were stepping into a space that had been transformed not by any physical change but by the knowledge that it was now truly hers to defend without fear of official reprisal, and yet the silence that greeted her seemed heavier than before, the forest pressing in with a kind of watchful stillness. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching the worn beams and the uneven table her uncle had built, and for the first time in weeks she did not feel as though invisible hands had rearranged her belongings in her absence. Everything remained exactly where she had left it, and the simple continuity brought a rush of relief so sharp it left her trembling. The neighbors, who had once turned cold eyes toward her, began to thaw in small ways, an old man raising his hand in a tentative wave when she passed on the road, a woman leaving a basket of apples at the edge of her clearing without a note. Gestures that acknowledged both the trial she had endured and the quiet victory she had won. Still, the shadow of Karen lingered, for the Marsh house remained closed and silent, curtains drawn tight, no smoke rising from the chimney. Rumors drifted through the valley that she had left in disgrace, retreating to stay with distant relatives, but Lucy knew better than to believe absence meant surrender. At night, when the wind rustled through the pines, she sometimes imagined the echo of Karen's voice whispering that paper fades, but people remember, and though the words no longer carried the same power, they reminded her that memory could never be erased entirely. Yet, rather than fear, the thought inspired in her a strange sense of resilience, for she had faced memory with fact, intimidation with persistence, and in the end, it was not erasure that had saved her, but endurance. One evening, she sat on the porch as twilight deepened, the forest settling into its nocturnal rhythm, and her eyes fell upon a stone half buried near the stream where she often fetched water. Kneeling to brush away moss, she uncovered an old carving, the initials L.H. and the date 1957, etched by her uncle when he first claimed the land. The discovery felt like a final benediction, a message from the past affirming that the place had always carried a rightful story, one that no invention or distortion could undo. She traced the letters with her fingertips, and in that moment she understood that the cabin was no longer simply a structure she had been forced to defend, but a legacy she had chosen to carry forward. The fight had scarred her, yes, but it had also bound her more tightly to the land than she could ever have imagined. And as the night closed around her, she sat in stillness, no longer waiting for footsteps in the dark, but listening to the steady pulse of the valley, a rhythm that at last belonged to her,